Welcome back, everyone. Those of you who are sticking with us through this long three-part session. We're ready to begin the third installment, the last set of three presentations, looking at more radical alternatives to mainstream approaches to managing tourism growth. So plenty of time for all of this and still discussion afterwards, so I won't be as militant with the time management as I have been in the past. But I will still at least let you know where you're at in your presentations, and you can decide how to proceed. So, without further ado, let's move into the first presentation, and then field some clarification questions afterwards. So, Nora, whenever you're ready.
I didn't find the way to unmute me, so I think now it's fine. Okay, thank you. Welcome. I'm Nora. I'm a PhD student at the University of the Balearic Islands, and I'm investigating the relation of conservation and tourism in the case of Mallorca and one of the islands of the Balearics. Today with my contribution, with the presentation, I aim to contribute to the critique of neoliberal conservation in context of the global north, even though I think I should say in context of Europe, after the presentation of Magdalena, and also to the post-capitalist proposals of convivial conservations. This is of relevance as neoliberal conservation has been studied primarily in cases of the global south. Furthermore, the socio-ecological crisis demonstrates a deteriorated humanity-nature relationship with nature created as external, so that its limits can be ignored for the sake of the accumulation of capital. The convivial conservation approach aims to overcome this human nature alienation. Additionally, in the or in the context of the pandemic, the importance of being in contact with nature has been highlighted with the increased demand for outdoor recreation and proximity. This actually exacerbates previous trends of over-tourism in protected areas and the related problems to it, like the disturbance of the fauna, littering issues, parking issues, or attacks of livestock by free-running dogs, etc. It also demonstrates an existing inequality in existing open spaces and natural environments, as not everyone is in possession of land, and highlights the urgent need for the improvement of public recreation areas and natural environments. So in this context, my research questions are: first, what role does private property have in the nexus of conservation and recreation tourism? How is nature commodified, and what role does the commodification of nature play in explaining overcrowding or over-tourism? And what would convivial turn imply? And can we already find elements of conviviality in conservation and recreation practice? So next, I will talk about the theoretical framework, the neoliberal conservation, and the critique on the commodification of nature, and I will explain the convivial conservation approach, to then focus on my case study to answer the questions on the role of private property, the commodification, and how commodification happens in the case of the Shara de Tramontana, and how over-tourism is managed, and what elements of conviviality do already exist. I want to end this presentation with a discussion on how the commodification of nature may be turned into a more convivial alternative. And shortly, my research is was a case study, and I basically based it on interviews with managers of the Shara de Tramontana. Environmental deterioration made conservation necessary in the first place, and from the 19th century onwards, it was approached primarily by the creation of protected areas to save nature from human interference, but at the same time promoting its contemplation and the recreation in nature. It manifests a fundamental capitalist logic of nature being external to human activity, ignoring that the environmental impacts of capitalist production does not stop at the park boundaries. In a neoliberal context, the separated nature is further subsumed to capital through its commodification, that is the process of transforming anything into an exchangeable commodity on the market. According to Costry, this commodification of nature implies 6 aspects, which is privatization, valuation, displacement, abstraction, alienation, and individuation, on which I will focus this question on how nature is commodified in my case. Ecotourism is one of the examples of the commodification of nature through the creation of an imaginary of a pristine nature that can experience on protected areas, and as it is argued to provide a win-win situation for local economic development and for biodiversity protection. It is critiqued basically for commodifying the nature, putting a price on its enjoyment, and implying the privatization of land and the displacement of former users and users. So basically the main challenges of conservation, let's say, is the alienation of humanity and nature and its commodification, and it is the convivial conservation approaches and proposal, a post-capitalist proposal to approach these challenges. It is characterized, or there are some elements that are essential to convivial conservation, which is the establishment of long-lasting and engaging relationships between different natures based on knowledge and respect, to overcome the separation between humanity and nature, the promotion of understanding and knowledge of all kinds of nature, and the decommodification of nature, or the implementation of a volume system that is not based on the market system. It implies also the direct democracy and participation in the decision making without the discrimination due to gender, class, ethnicity, or anything else. So I will come now to explain you the results of the first results of my case study. The case study is the Tramontana, which is a mountain range in Mallorca. It is a case that is of special interest as it is located in this mass tourism destination, Mallorca. And it is also interesting, it has 2 protection figures. On the one hand, it is declared a natural site with the aim to protect its biodiversity and ecosystem functioning. But on the other hand, it is also declared cultural world heritage by the UNESCO, aiming to preserve the cultural values, basically the architectonical structures of agriculture and forestry. So we have already quite thematic protection of this area. Another aspect that is quite interesting in my case is that all interviewees highlight the fact that the Tramontana is private land mainly, and there's only 5% in public property. So actually, in this case, we cannot talk about privatization as one of the aspects of commodification, as it is already all private. There's no transfer from a public or common lands to become private land. On the contrary, in the past there has been expropriation of land to become public land with aims of conservation or to supply outdoor recreation areas, etc. These expropriation are related to displacement of previous owners or users, and explain and this overall situation of this private land explains also the intense need of collaboration between the private and the public sector, which is quite like made quite clear by instruments like the land stewardship, as which kind of accept this basic general structure of private property, which is facilitating and ignoring this problem, no, facilitating the accumulation of capital in the hands of a few. So here, one of the parts of the answering the first question is like private property is like quite the fundament of conservation and recreation in this area. And further aspects of the commodification, the Tramontana is promoted within a wider tourism strategy of Mallorca as an alternative to deseasonalize the sun and beach tourism of the whole island and to stimulate a more responsible and quality tourism in the Tramontana. This strategy is widely accepted in the Mallorcan society. However, it is quite interesting or curious that the Tramontana is promoted to deseasonalize tourism, but it provokes seasonalizing tourism in the Tramontana, especially in spring and in the autumn season, when the issues of over tourism became actually an issue due to the interviewees and the experience here. It is the scenic resources that are the fundament for the livelihoods in the Tramontana by exploiting these patrimonial values in tourism. And the declaration of the Tramontana as a cultural world heritage has even increased the tourism, so that over-tourism becomes more and more an issue in this area. In this situation, agriculture enters actually a quite contradictory position, as the scenic values or the cultural the scenic values, the landscape that is so attractive for tourism is produced by the result of the agricultural infrastructures and the terraces. We can see here these terraces, so protecting the traditional agriculture and other practices become relevant in the way to promoting this tourist destination. So
we have about 5 minutes left.
Okay. So the proposal of creating a Tramontana brand exemplifies quite well this contradiction when the agricultural products are valued to maintain the tourist attractiveness of the Tramontana destination by offering an exclusive product to visitors. All this promotion is also related to displacement. The increased market value of the Tramontana as a tourist destination attract foreign capitals that leads to the displacement of residents for living, emphasized even since the upsurge of holiday rentals, and also former users are displaced to make space for tourism. In sum, or answering also the second question, by promoting a tourist product, Tramontana, the nature is valued, abstracted, and alienated by putting a price on it and creating an ideal imaginary of its natural and cultural values that can enter the market to be exchanged. It implies this displacement, and in this case, we cannot, however, talk about privatization of nature. So the next question, all this commodification process leading to overcrowding, over tourism in the is how this is managed under private and public land. So basically, access to private property is mainly not managed with a proper management and proper resources dedicated to it, but there are some properties there's one with an entry fee. Some properties are limiting the visitors or the visiting days. There are also one with a reserve. You can also only access with a guide and reservation for this reservation. Other actions like information boards or the environmental education programs are promoted on various properties, and all some interviewees are actually demanding an increase in public recreation area as a proposal to handle over tourism, and lots of land owners ask for compensation as they are maintaining their properties and the viewpoints and the tourist attractions, um, while the promotion is made by the public and private tourism sector, and the revenues are gained by the tourism sector. So in all this, what convivial elements can we found? The third question. So I think the education programs and volunteering programs and some properties are actually promoting long-lasting and engaging relationships with nature. There is a lack in democratic participation or in the decision-making process of how to manage the nature access and the recreation in it. However, there's one like a round table. There are participation instruments by the public sector. However, those are like really exclusive to the more powerful elite. And there's another example, as I told in the previous session, La Trapa, which is organized and managed by a non-governmental organization where decision making is actually more open. This ask or this demand to increase the public land for recreation, I think this can hints already to this need to rethink the property regime that excludes low-income non-land owners from enjoying nature, and suggest a more common regime to manage this land. And I think this is like I leave it here, and when we have more questions afterwards, we can discuss deeper. So thank you for your attention.
Well, thank you, and perfect timing as well. All right. Usual clarification questions before we move into the next presentation. Well, let's do it. We'll do our 3 presentations and then have a chance to discuss them in conjunction. Alicia, take it away, please.
Thank you. My paper is titled Pandas of Gaya and Assemblages of Post-Capitalist Tourism. Before I get into the paper, very focusedly discussing about post-capitalist tourism, or why I call them as assemblages of post-capitalist tourism, I would like to start this discussion by like a prelude and a connection to some of the discussions which have preceded in the previous sessions. And I'll pick on 2 of the concepts that we discussed. One is like Mills very interestingly puts this idea that whenever we talk about a policy paradigm, the policy paradigm is relevant provided it is able to capture the existing trends, but it helps to understand something which is actually existing on the ground in terms of tourism questions. And going into that question, Moritz gives us a very interesting discussion about how degrowth tourism definitely occurred because of the pandemic, and tourism did take a slump, so on and so forth. But what happened in my paper is something very interesting in the sense that we started this. This is basically a master thesis project of one of my students who worked with me on the idea of religious tourism in Gaya. We did this project in 2020 with the idea that we are looking into the question of why religious tourism is so very important to give a small town like Gaya in India a kind of a facelift, and why tourism was so very critical for putting it into the map of urbanization, as they say. So I like tourism-induced urbanization. But what finally happened was COVID-19, and what we ended up is something serendipitous, where we found that the priests who work in the temple of Gaya, for which it is famous, is the assemblage which makes it work. Now, and that is why we followed up that research work in 2021 when we started focusing on the pandas. So basically, this topic starts with the idea that, well, of course, when it's question of religion or faith-based tourism, then there is a unflinching idea that yes, even if there are slums or there can be ebbs and flows in tourism, because faith is something which will drive people to their chosen destination. So this entire logic of having over tourism or an under tourism somehow the other does not fit to this context, like where there is religious tourism and people would come in, come what may, whether there is a pandemic or there is not a pandemic. Now, what happens in Gaya is interesting is that in Hindus there is this whole idea of you have to immerse you have to do a puja at a place called Gaya, where if you do not do a puja, it is not expected that your forefathers would attain solace in the heavens. Now, this is a general idea that the folklore that goes. Now, the entire of India, there's only one place which is Gaya, which is supposed to be so. Now, interestingly, Gaya falls in the poorest state of the country, which is Bihar, and and admissibly, then the kind of infrastructure and the provision that it provides is very bad. So now you have a catch situation where you cannot be with Gaya, you cannot be without Gaya. So in this kind of limbo situation, you will have such places like Gaya where you have to go, you have to see as to how Gaya survives itself in a situation like COVID-19, where the very little state support that it was getting officially was stopped because there were COVID-19 protocols in place, so on and so forth. And all this discussion and studies that we had, that whether we can take Gaya into the map of India as a major tourist destination or not, whether it can be a poor, it can be a strategy for pro-poor growth, whether it can give jobs, so on and so forth, went outside the winds. It was just not possible. Now, before we understand this kind of an idea of Gaya, let me give you a brief snippet about the national tourism policy in the country and how that and what I mean, with special reference to religious tourism. So in the 1980s, India's national policy always wanted to see that religious places are developed as tourist circuits. So in the sense that there are natural places and there are also religious places which can be seen together. So they wanted to build tourism circuits. In 1990s, it started taking a very human capital development approach, where they expected that tourist places will give local employment. In the 2000s, they wanted to make it like a mass employment situation, not about very niche, like they wanted to have all these self-employed schemes, so on and so forth. But in 2020s, it was the era of sustainability and all that, and they talking about protection of monuments, cultural heritage, so on and so forth. In case of India, what interestingly happens is there are even divergences where you have religious tourism across states, where there are richer states which will also sponsor religious tourism, and there will be poorer states which will also have religious tourism. Now, places like say Gujarat or Orissa or Jammu Kashmir, they have a very good temple shrine board. So say the local cultural heroes and the government are hand in glove with each other, and it is more systematized and it goes on. But in Bihar, the problem is that it is the poorest state of the country, where there is an immediate mistrust between the Hindu groups and of course the administration, where they feel that the only source of employment that they have is the temple, because the place does not have industries, it does not have natural resources. So the only thing is it has this rocky mountain terrain where there is a piece of land, the Gaya temple, and there is a river which goes by where you can do the rituals. So the Bihari tourists, the priests, or the pandas, which I call, were simply not happy to let the state government take over, and that is why the situation became more worse gradually, because everything was so informal. Keeping that in mind, in 2019 when we started the study, 2020 when we started the study, we started with this idea to find out as to why has Gaya failed to develop as a major tourist destination. But in 2020, we added the second question as to what are the prospects of post-capitalist pathways as such. Because in our initial studies, in our first round study, that is 2019, when we first conducted a baseline survey, because as I tell you, it is a very unorganized sector here in Gaya. Even if it has an airport, which is the only one in the state apart from the national capital, state capital, we had to almost conduct a baseline survey around the temple area. This is the temple area, which the the Vishnupath temple around which all the rituals are conducted. And we found that the universe size was something like this. On the left, there were around 7 to 8 lakhs people who are visiting. That was from the Bihar State Transport Development Corporation records. And then we did a baseline survey of the shopkeepers, the travel tour operators, which are the number of government officials who are working there, and how many priests are in charge of the temple. So then we, you know, it was not very easy for us to really go for kind of a stratified sample because the season was so erratic in the sense that first of all people will come on, so there will be different segments of the year when tourists will come in, because that is when there's a good fortunate time when they will do the rituals, so on and so forth. So what we ensured was that in order to keeping our mind at ensuring a certain kind of a diversity in the sample of different kinds of people who come here, different types of shopkeepers, we did a kind of a snowball sampling, and we went for around 60, 70 semi-structured interviews. Yeah. So sorry. Yeah. So when in our interviews in 2009, 21 round of the interviews, what we did was we started using the same index which the World Economic Forum Travel and Tourism Competitiveness Index uses, so that we can have some kind of a language which can be understood across the Indian context as well. So this were the scores which were at the global forum. There were certain scores at the India forum. This was what India had scored. So without letting our respondents know about what are the final scores, we actually asked them to mark on a scale of 1 to 7 as to why do you think and how do you rate these figures, an enabling environment or travel tourism policy, infrastructure, so on and so forth. So these were the major criteria that we used were actually these ones: the business environment, safety, security. So we had questions for all of this: airport infrastructure, price competitiveness, international openness, so on and so forth. And what we found was that yes, people were of course very unhappy about the fact that things here are not at all in place, and it is very informal, and the state government does not push in a lot of money. Investors are not happy to come in because it is a very erratic market, so on and so forth. But what was very surprising is in 2020 when we find that the state had officially stopped supporting any kind of tourist footfall. And yet in 2020, the trains were swarming with people, the flights were full, all that, the hotels were running full capacity. Uh, and then these local households where these pandas or the priests, local priests are these local networks, and I think the term which I'll really borrow from my previous presenter, conviviality, the conviviality of the priest was really found to be very crucial in this context. And that is why I say that there is a need for us to understand the assemblages of post-capitalist tourism. What I mean by the assemblages here is that, of course, very quickly, I don't want to lecture on Deleuze and Guattari's concept of assemblage, to be very rudimentary at this stage, but however, you may quick glance, assemblage is basically a multiplicity constituted by heterogeneous units. So basically, it is not about the units per se or the heterogeneous units, but it is more about the connections that people have or constituents have. So what happens is, if you can look at this diagram, technically,
5 minutes left, just to get you.
Okay. So basically, the state government and the tourists and the travel operators are somewhere dispersed. Now, the pandas and the religious priests, what they do is they ensure. So, what the concept of pandas here is that there are specific states representing which you have the priests which work in this temple. So, whenever an ex tourist has gone from this place after performing his or her rites or the pujas, so what they do is they give them the lead to come here. So in the place where formal gig economy or say OYO services or ex services have all halted, what these pandas do is that they say that, well, we'll do your pujas, we'll also let you know where informally you can stay and how informally you can conduct all your rituals within the given time. So in a sense, what I'm arguing here is that, what I'm arguing here is that at a point in time where there has been a complete structural paralysis, there is a lack of transparency in political clout amongst and mistrust amongst the administrative brass and the priest. This segment of priests have become, in a way, a very post-capitalist entity, which is ensuring that tourism does come into the state even under these hostile circumstances. And secondly and finally, one more argument that, however, I want to mention here is that in this kind of a post-capitalist pathways, which is actually serendipitously opened up in the post-COVID situation, uh, also poses to us certain limitations of this post-capitalist pathway, because at the end of the day, there are certain class structures which is also there within the tourists. So of course, I mean, people can stay in hostile circumstances because it's a question of faith, and they will take all the pain to stay even if there is no arrangement, but yet they will not endure, or this kind of a knee-jerk stopgap arrangement cannot really endure itself if we do not develop a hub and spoke model, which is basically ensuring that similar religious sites across this place are integrated, and certain kind of an effective information system is kept on, put on, and of course the traffic has to be taken care, because there are certain limitations that the Panda administration and commercial operators triad can really afford to take care of. So there are some limitations of this assemblages as well. So with that in mind, my final take would be that yes, post-capitalist pathways are very much possible, not as necessarily as an antidote to neoliberal pathways, but of course as mere strategies of survival under hostile circumstances. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Very interesting. Yeah, again, clarification questions as we get ready for the last final presentation in this series. We'll bring it all together. No pressure. All right, let's have our final presentation, and then we can discuss everything in conjunction. You're muted still.
Ivan is fighting with his computer.
Okay, can you hear me? Okay, I'll try to share the presentation just a moment.
I saw the presentation before.
Yeah, but I have to try.
It's up.
Yeah, he does.
Okay, is that right now?
No.
Oh shit. I'll try it again. Okay.
Screen one.
Screen one.
Share.
I'll put it.
Yeah, that was a screen one.
Okay.
Now it's up.
How is it?
All in all.
Okay, great. So that's it. I'm not going to talk anymore. Well, I'm going to start this last presentation. Thank you for all the other presentations. This is a very personal presentation that comes from a conversation with some other colleagues, not only on net. We have worked together in this presentation, but it's something that it's an ongoing presentation with other colleagues, and this I'm going to present you to explain a little bit about our process, how we have ended up in this kind of a new research on post-capitalist tourism. Well, first of all, we have to, even if it's obvious, we have to remember that tourism in its actual form, it's one of the major capitalist ways of accumulation. So it has been playing a very important role in the logic of capital at a planetary scale, particularly after the 2008 financial crisis until the COVID one. So we have seen an amazing increase of the touristification process at the global scale, with an ever-expanding never expansion of the tourist commodity frontier to almost all parts of the world. But then the COVID crisis arrived and made a halt in the touristification process. It has been very funny to see many organizations, like for instance the World Tourism Organization, saying that the COVID crisis is a time for rethinking tourism and restart tourism and so on and so forth. Instead of the rhetoric of going to normal, that's been more about, okay, it's time to rethink, but okay, we have been laughing very much since we have been hearing all that. The COVID-19 can be conceptualized particularly as a gateway of times of chronic emergencies, of the systemic crisis we are in, particularly now that have been accelerated. And moreover, the COVID crisis has been also an example of the, explosion of the contradictions of capital in this kind of a terminal capital state we are in. So we have at the same time astronomical profits by the platform capitalists, people dying in the hospitals, and again the hunger queues that are getting longer in many parts of the world. This time can be understood as a moment of the acceleration of multiple emergencies and crises that are getting combined. Following Jason Moore, we could think that this is a combination of a developmental crisis with an epochal crisis. It's not only a crisis of a regime of accumulation, but also it's a crisis of capitalism itself as a mode of domination. So we're facing a kind of a capitalism pre-fall. Why? Because now it's a situation where capital contradictions are extremely hardly to be fixed in a consistent manner. So it's very hard to find a new regime of accumulation securing large profits for capital in a stabilized way. And if we're talking in a capitalism pre-fall, we have to talk as well on a capitalism pre-fall. That means capitalist tourism pre-fall too. So that's the moment we are right now with the COVID crisis that has crystallized all those contradictions. But something we have been talking about is that, okay, but despite the crisis of capitalism, tourism, or whatever you want to call it, leisure, recreation, and other human activities we have been doing for a long time, a long history, will not disappear and not. So the question is how tourism, recreation, leisure, or whatever you want to call it, will look like in the post-capitalist societies. Another aspect we have been thinking about and discussing in the last times is, okay, what's the goal of radical scholarship? For a long time, radical scholars have been very busy in analyzing, understanding the political economy of capital. And regarding the radical scholars in tourism, we have been also very busy trying to understand how tourism capital works. But following Gibson Graham works, we could say that also this capitalocentric approach has obstructed imagination of envisioning an anti-capitalist forms of social organization in tourism, particularly. So, okay, we have to remember that the point is to change it. So, radical scholars, I think that we should work for changing it, not only understanding, analyzing very perfectly how it works. So, here I come back to the idea of Neil Smith when he wrote The Revolutionary Imperative, where, okay, revolution might come like a thief in the night, but the thief needs to come with a few tools and some are, of course, intellectual ideas, but most importantly, they are social and political organization for more human future. So different authors, I think that we could conceptualize revolution as the political project of self-emancipation for overcoming all forms of domination. So here we combine, I mean, from an heterodox point of view, different authors sometimes that are not very much combined, but I think that it's very useful, the approach of Eric Olin Wright, David Harvey analysis, and also the very interesting contributions from Julie Graham and Katie Getson, and of course John Holloway works, which inspired by very much the Zapatista movement. So something that we should think about, talk about is, okay, should we wait for the revolutionary moment, that third in the night, or we should look for utopias here and now in the cracks of capitalism? If we have a look to the diverse economies iceberg in the capitalist system, I mean, live together many other economic systems, social forms of organizing production and consumption, of course, subject of contradictions because they are crossed by the capitalist dynamics. But despite of that, we have to bear in mind that they exist here and now, and we don't have to wait for the magical moment. Following the Zapatista motto, the slogan they have used for a long time, it's very much related to that idea of resistance and rebellion. Resist capitalism, but also rebel against the logic of capital. That means resisting and constructing alternatives to capital. I think that one of the authors who have thought more and structure kind of a strategy, or kind of a project for a post-capitalist politics or anti-capitalist politics. It's Eric Olin Wright with his book of 2010, Envisioning Really Utopias, and the one that was published the year he died, How to Be an Anti-Capitalist in the 21st Century. Here you can have a very, rapid look to the different strategies, but basically it's about the ruptural transformation. There is smashing capitalism. This is, the classical strategy of the 20th century. We have seen many cases that didn't succeed. Following this strategy, then the interstitial transformation that are occurring in the spaces and cracks of capitalism. This, also relates to the idea developed by John Holloway, and then the symbiotic transformation that it's also called in How to Be an Anti-Capitalist as taming capitalism. And in relation to all that, of course, we have to talk about the resisting capitalism strategy. But this strategy is not about transforming, but resisting capitalism. And the overarching strategy can be conceptualized as eroding capitalism. In most of the, scholars in tourism studies and also social movements have been basically the anti-capitalist or post-capitalist strategies deployed so far have been concentrated on taming and resisting tourism capital. Here, for instance, you have some examples in Mallorca in the early 70s, in the 2000s in Costa Rica against tourism-related water project, or in the last year against over-tourism in Barcelona. Other strategies for taming tourism capital are exemplified by the workers' struggles for fair working conditions. These strategies are trying to reduce the harms of tourism capital, but not so much about transforming capital. But in doing so, they are somehow also reducing the power of capital, let's say. Another type of taming tourism capitalism is the role of medium-sized corporation that, despite their contradiction, they work in the margins of the logics of capital. An example of that is the case of Cesar Tioga in Brazil, which is, a very, very interesting case study on social tourism, and Ernest has worked a lot on that. Other projects are blooming in the crux of tourism capital, not in the global north, or are not so important in the global north, but particularly in the global south, and we're studying, because it's the place we are more related in our political struggles in Latin America and Spain, and we know some cases very interesting in Latin America, like the one that appears here is the Bauen Hotel, which is an occupied hotel by the workers who created a workers' cooperative. But those are scattered projects, and the idea is, or something that we should think about, has to scale up all these different strategies and practices and projects all together in order to influence the, tourism policies. Until now, tourism policies have been fundamentally addressed towards to the reproduction of capital through tourism, so are more like a corporate policies and pro-tourism policies or pro-capitalist tourism policies. So the shift from resisting tourism capitalism, the shift from analyzing tourism capital to transforming tourism under another type of logic, another from the post-capitalist dimension. I think one of our ideas is that we can break or start breaking dominant narrative, which is subject the tourism political agenda. So in this regard, the post-capitalist focus might break the consensus, the social consensus around tourism policies, and introduce another focus, and in doing so, readdress the way the tourism policies are formulated. Here you have a very, very brief summary of some of the fundamentals of the post-capitalist tourism policy, particularly in three blocks. One is the one related to the dismantling of pro-capital tourism policies, particularly in the very high touristified spaces. It's not about, or not only about looking for alternative strategies, but it's about the touristification and diversification. It's very hard to find out those small projects of post-capitalist forms of organizing tourism, because here is the predominant are the logics of capital with concentration and centralization of the tourism production system. Another aspect which is extremely relevant, particularly in times of climate emergency and the end of oil, it's the stop all those policies oriented toward international tourism. And in relation to that one, it's avoiding and removing support to high-class tourism, which is one of the major strategies in many of these places. Regarding the production system, the production system is inspired by the social economy principles, and in this regard, the support to collective and cooperative initiatives, and the development of social tourism at large scale, but not social tourism understood as a bailout of the tourism industry, but social tourism inspired by convivial aspects or convivial approach. The combination of tourism, leisure, and policies with public transport policies, and with redesigning the urban and metropolitan space areas by increasing the green public spaces. Another aspect which was earlier addressed by Ernest is that post-capitalist tourism must be or will be a proximity tourism, particularly because of the climate emergency and somehow the end of the cheap traveling or international cheap travels. And this will mean a radical shift and crisis in global tourism, and the proximity will be the new space of tourism development, and in becoming the new space of tourism development, it's going to be the new space of conflict and struggles. And in relation to that, proximity tourism might mean a lower ecological footprint, but not necessarily a post-capitalist transformation. Post-capitalist transformation requires political action, requires social organization. Finally, and this is something that it sometimes has been criticized in Eric Olin write books, is that in times of capitalism freefall and tourism capital freefall, there will be presumably an increase of the violence of the state and capitalism. So in this regard, the struggles are going to be, increasing, particularly in the proximity spaces, and post-capitalism tourism needs to be understood as a conflictual process, investing capital in terms of building a more just and sustainable society. So what is important about the post-capitalist tourism projects, despite the fact that they are scattered, despite the fact that they have contradictions, is the fact that they are the social and political organizational forms for a better and more human future. Okay, that's all, and thank you very much for your attention.
All right, absolutely perfect timing, and also a very nice pulling together, I think, of the various strands of discussion so far. So a good touchstone then for our final discussion about the relationship between all of the different presentations and issues raised here, and then moving towards next steps forward. There's a future discussion and engagement. We still have a fairly large group of participants who've sticking with us until the bitter end. Any comments, questions for this set of presenters?
Rob, can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, sure. I think I'm not from the tourism sector, like I'm a sociologist, do not work in tourism, so that's why maybe I'm asking more of the question because I'm finding it more interesting with time. My question is to Ivan. Ivan, you make this thing, I see somewhere you write this term social tourism. And I have read in my text about something about this solidarity economy. And then is there any relationship between this social tourism, solidarity economy, and what what your co-authored provocative article on post-capitalist tourism? Maybe, it seems very similar, but I'm sure that there are points of differences. If we could neatly, dissect it, what are the relationship between solidarity economy, social tourism, and post-capitalist pathways tourism, maybe? I don't know. Rob can
A complex set of issues.
Yeah.
Yvonne or Ernest, I don't know if you would like to pick this up.
Okay, Ernest, I answer, and if you want to add something, or do you want to answer?
Okay, can you start?
Okay. I have a screen there, and the computer here, and it's a bit mad. Well, the thing, it's interesting what you asked, because social tourism could be understood as a part of the social and solidarity economy, but it's not necessarily this. Social tourism, it's as far as it is understood in many countries, is it's part of the tourism promoted by the state or by large organizations for in theory social purposes. So for, in order to include people who are excluded or marginalized from tourism, basically. This had a strong, role in the promotion of tourism, particularly in the 60s and 70s, in certain countries, and with a more, we could say, a more social democratic approach. Afterwards, in many countries, this just became a way of subsidizing the tourism capital, particularly in the low seasons. So it has been part of the state apparatus in subsidizing the tourism industry. But saying that, we could add that social tourism could be a very strong tool for taming tourism capital. By taming tourism capital, it also can be a gateway for transforming and eroding tourism capital. And this is happening in particular countries, but it doesn't come, without social conflict, without social struggle, and of course, without social organization. The problem is that, for instance, here in Spain, we have seen social tourism just as part of the state capital apparatus without demanding a transformation, without struggling and making a conflict of that in order to transform the tourism policies, at least in this regard. So the important thing here is that social tourism could be infected, contaminated by the principles of the social and solidarity economy. I don't know if I have responded to you, and if you want to add something else, so I am mute the mic.
Does anyone else weighing in on this issue? Is that answer satisfactory, or should we discuss a bit further?
No, I think it was clear. I think that last line was very clear that that it can contaminate social tourism instead. I think thank you. It was very clear.
Good. Anything else? Any clarification or a response back to the 3 sets of presentations here, focused on conceptualizing post-capitalist spaces in different ways?
Something I would like. Well, it's because it's very late, so we're getting dead. Well, something I would like to highlight is a kind of an emerging research project. Well, we are familiar with some projects in Spain and in Latin America too, but since we have people from different parts, I think this could be, at the beginning of an overall project. From different parts of the world, because I'm sure that there are many other, experiences around and we are not familiar with, and this would be, a very interesting moment for starting this kind of more ambitious project at international scale.
I very much agree, and yeah, that's definitely one of the outcomes we're hoping from a set of sessions is to bring together a larger collection of people thinking in these terms, right? In conversation, you need to figure out exactly what that discussion will look like and where it will be based. You're still muted. Yeah, good.
Sorry.
You're
Rob, if I could really give another trigger to this discussion here, because this is on my reading of your joint authored article, the pathways to post-capitalist tourism, and the 3 examples that you gave, the Barcelona one, the Brazil one, so on, the 3 of them which you give. Somewhere or the other, how do you really think that, or to what extent, because it has something been really dealt more in urban studies literature, where the illegal and the legal, that a lot has been written where southern urbanism and people have been straying that, this entire discussion about that the global north is about formality and it is informal at the south, it doesn't really work, and rather, that there are crossovers everywhere. What role do what I'm trying to ask is post-capitalist, are post-capitalist pathways then nothing but an exaggeration of informal modes of tourism? Can someone just say that, what you're saying is something very nice, but this is something what people have always done. They have known how to tamper with the law, rule book, municipal regulations, so on and so forth. So this was always there. Why do you want to call it post-cap? How do we really say that no, post-capitalist pathways is not about informality? It is about something else. How can we really do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I think you're hitting on an important aspect of the discussion here. If I could just respond at least to part of it briefly, and I think the way we conceptualize this is the kind of things you're talking about, or we're talking about by Oldenwright and Gibson Graham, is more of these kind of interstitial, forms of transformation, right? And playing with things, kind of at the margins, creating alternatives in local spaces. Right? And the point of our analysis was to build on that, but also move away from that, because that is kind of the primarily focus of discussion. Yeah, and whether you call these things post-capitalist or not, I think depends on the context and the frame that you analyze it. But our idea was then to build on Oldenwright's kind of updating of his analysis to move beyond these more interstitial movements, and develop more of this kind of multi-scalar analysis of ways in which you can also think about, potentials for different forms of post-capitalism at different scales, right? Beyond that, and the potential for things, more socialist alternatives being promoted, within municipal administration, and how that can move into tourism policy, even at the national scale in terms of infusing, these forms of social tourism that we analyzed, particularly in Brazil. Right, as moving at least in this direction. Okay? And this is always a very difficult area, right? Because you're talking about things that are situated in particular points in time, are riddled with contradictions, right? And so it becomes the question of you look at it from one angle and you see something that is absorbed within the larger capitalist order and potentially can be seen as ways in which supposedly non-capitalist practices actually end up kind of supporting, right, or contributing to a larger capitalist system. From another perspective, you see things that depart, to varying degrees from the kind of stereotypical mode of production, right? And then the question becomes, to what extent is this just, the frame that we use to analyze these things, right? Not within the perspective itself. But for us, it was important because there had been very little work actually, trying to conceptualize post-capitalism in tourism, right, at these different levels of scales, and to show that from this lens you can potentially conceptualize a wider range of activities that have been done thus far in terms of contributing to this overarching strategy, as a basis for stimulating a larger discussion. So, I mean, whether this proves fruitful, and useful in the future, in terms of inspiring this discussion, we hope it does, but it remains to be seen. How well it holds up empirically in different contexts, I would say.
So then as a follow-up to that, then can we say then that post-capitalist pathways necessarily are exactly doing this, that they do not want us to think through binaries, and they're talking about hybridity? Is it about hybridity then?
Sorry, I'm trying to balance my domestic duties at this point too. We're getting into the evening here. I would say, yeah, hybridity. Okay, get it. Yeah, take it. Hybridity, but from a certain point of view, right? There's hybridity and there's hybridity. So I mean, it's about how you conceptualize that hybridity, and how these examples that we're talking about, what extent they actually do present, kind of viable challenges to a business as usual approach. So then it becomes more of a question of degrees, I think, rather than of just presenting either binaries or a combination thereof, right? My 2 cents at least. Anyone else?